We are joined by Carl Bildt, former Prime Minister and ex-Minister of Foreign Affairs of Sweden.
Hello, nice to see you.
Good afternoon. We're happy to be talking to you live on TV Rain. The situation is intensifying. We're seeing the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and hearing the calls for a ceasefire. However, many of us realize that Israel cannot leave Hamas's aggression on October 7th without a response. Do you think there is a way out of this difficult situation?
Well, it's very difficult to see one, as a matter of fact. I mean, as you say, Israel can't leave it sort of just say nothing happened, because something very substantial happened with the Hamas attack. At the same time, there are 2.2 million people in Gaza. Some of them support Hamas, no question about that, but overall not. So go in there and trying to sort of get rid of Hamas completely is going to be an extremely difficult thing. With the risk that humanitarian consequences will be unacceptable, and the risk, of course, that you create problems for the future that might be even greater than the problems that you already have. So it is a very complicated, very grave situation where we can only hope that losses of human life will be minimized and that the conflict doesn't escalate any further.
Mr. Bildt, in order to ensure the minimization of civilian casualties and to prevent the conflict from expanding outward, it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the UN or other international institutions of similar scale could propose a blueprint for at least a temporary resolution. But all we hear are platitudes, like calling for a ceasefire without any specifics or terms. How did we find ourselves in this situation?
Well, I think UN is doing quite a lot in terms of the UN specialized agencies that are trying to get humanitarian supplies in. There's quite a lot of UN people on the ground. I mean, there are some inside Gaza. There's a lot of people in Egypt by the border trying to organize help. But there are, very few lorries are getting in. There was talk about some further today, but it's a trickle if you compare it with the need. On the political level, of course, we've had several meetings of the Security Council that doesn't produce very much of a consensus. So I think the time for diplomacy in that sense ain't there yet. But I hope there is a serious discussion in different capitals on the steps that need to be taken somewhat further down the road to get some sort of political perspective to avoid this conflict just going back time after time. And this is the fifth Gaza war that I've been aware of.
Well, the serious discussions are probably taking place, but as I understand, no specific action can be taken because of the internal disagreements, including, but not limited to, the UN Security Council. But there is also disagreement within the EU. There are reports that some 800 EU staff have written an official letter to the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, condemning her unjustifiable bias towards Israel. Can you please elaborate on why this is a problem?
Well, you are right. There are sort of, particularly at the beginning, there were sort of different views on how to tackle this and how strong one should emphasize the issues of international law and international humanitarian law. I think the EU has come together on that one. What has been unfortunate, if you look at the EU countries in the UN Security Council, in the sort of vote that was the other day on the resolution, you had 8 countries voting yes for it. It's France, Spain, to take 2 ones, 4 voting against, Hungary, Czech Republic among them, and most of them abstaining. And that sort of reflects the deep divisions that we have in our societies on the question of the Middle East, and the fact that I think the political environment was not ready for this kind of conflict. We haven't been discussing the Middle East conflict in our sort of foreign policy environment sufficiently. And that meant that when this happened, erupted, there isn't the consensus at the moment. And the letter to Ursula von der Leyen was just part of this.
What do you think the consequences of these internal disagreements might be?
No, if you take the ramifications inside the Commission, I don't think that's a major issue. But of course, the fact that the EU member countries are on different lines is regrettable. And what I would hope will happen is that one would come together and discuss what's the step after this. When the bombs stop falling and the guns go silent and Israel doesn't have the ability to do more than they've done in Gaza, what happens then? in terms of a resolution to the underlying conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, because we can't have a situation where the Middle East explodes time after time after time without any active diplomacy by the outside world to try to resolve the conflict.
Yes, it is difficult to understand why we're not seeing any active diplomacy at play. But speaking of the attitudes within the EU, I came across an opinion that Ukraine and Israel should not be looked at through the same lens, because naturally the new war in the Middle East is being likened to the war in Eastern Europe, which has been going on for over 20 months now. So the opinion is that Israel ought to be compared with Russia as opposed to Ukraine. Does an opinion like that hold any merit?
Well, I think the thing that needs to be emphasized in both cases is international law. I mean, the strong criticism, to put it very mildly, that we have against Russia is that's a fundamental violation of international law to invade other countries. I mean, that's fairly obvious, and we must stand on that very, very strongly. In addition, there are violations of international humanitarian law in the way that Russia conducts this particular aggression. In terms of Israel, it's also very important to stress international law. In this particular case of Israel, of course, has a right to defend itself. It was attacked, there's no question. But it didn't happen in a vacuum. Israel has been pursuing policies for a long time, the illegal settlements of West Bank, for example, and other issues, the total isolation of Gaza, which have been sort of borderline, clear violation of international law in terms of the settlements. So we must, from the European view, I think, be very strong on international law, both against Russia and against Hamas, certainly, but also against Israel in that particular case. That's the only solid foundation that we can have for the resolution of both of these conflicts.
But when we hear these arguments that this didn't come out of nowhere, and Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, mentioned Israel's violation of international law, such as building settlements in the West Bank, but surely that can't serve as justification for the massacre that we all witnessed on October 7th. Israel says, wait a minute, we have to respond to this particular instance of aggression and massacre of almost 1,500 people. This looks like a catch-22 situation. Israel has the right to defend itself, but at the same time, this didn't come out of nowhere. Mr. Bildt, how can this be resolved?
Well, I think they're perfectly possible to reconcile. It's true that Israel has a right and indeed a duty to take action against Hamas for the horrible terror attack. At the same time, we have to look at sort of the conflict as a whole. And then issues like settlement and other issues needs to be dealt with. If we are going to have some sort of movement, also political perspective and some sort of peace in this region, I mean, it's not imminent, to put it mildly, then we must go back to international law. Terrorism, absolutely unacceptable. Illegal settlements, absolutely unacceptable. A number of other things, absolutely unacceptable. And there is an international law. I mean, EU does have, on paper, a fairly strong position on these issues, on the principles upon which two-state solutions can be built. And I would hope that perhaps a couple of weeks, perhaps a couple of months down the road, that we will have a more intense discussion on how we can start to move on those issues and in that direction.
As far as I know, Sweden abstained from voting on the resolution calling for a ceasefire that did not include condemnation of Hamas's actions. Do you support abstaining from voting in this matter?
Yes, that was the position taken by quite a number of EU countries. As I said, there were some who voted yes and some voted no. Most of them abstained. And that was not because there was a disagreement with anything that was in the resolution necessarily, but the fact that a previous attempt by a Canadian resolution to have a more clear condemnation of Hamas had not been accepted by the General Assembly.
In other words, we can plainly see how polarized the world is on this issue, and it only exacerbates the feeling that there can be no end to this conflict, at least not in the near future. I would like to come back to the topic of Sweden becoming a NATO member. On the one hand, Turkey finally acquiesced. On the other, Erdogan is expressing very aggressive opinions on the crisis in the Middle East, which is not the unanimous stance of the treaty organization. For example, Turkey's president claims that Hamas are not terrorists, but are in fact liberation fighters. How would you explain these mind games of Erdogan's?
Well, Turkey is one of those countries that have maintained a relationship with Hamas over the years. They're not alone. There are a number of them. Qatar is another one that is well known, but there are others who have done it without having too many press releases. And we should not forget, by the way, that also Israel and the United Nations had a relationship with Hamas when they were governing Gaza, because that was simply unavoidable to manage the day-to-day relationship. Then President Erdogan has taken a very strong line in this particular case. I think he's carried it too far. And I think there's a risk of him sort of undermining the role that Turkey otherwise could play in bridging the differences here. But let's see where this ends up.
Does Sweden joining NATO change anything, in your opinion?
Well, not in this particular respect. No, NATO is not an organization for sort of foreign policy discussions. I mean, NATO is for territorial defense. And the fact that sort of we are not yet formally in, but de facto Finland is in, it means that we will have stronger defense, stronger deterrence, more stability, I think, for the entire Northern European area. And I think that is important. We will have an integration of our defense efforts and our deterrence efforts with NATO, needless to say, the Americans, the Brits, and the others. And we hope that will continue to increase security. I think it's particularly important for the three Baltic countries that are, of course, in a more exposed position when we have these sort of different revisionist and revanchist sentiments bubbling up in Russia.
Turkey remains a member of NATO despite all these claims and mind games. I can't really think of a more fitting term. Despite all that, Turkey is not becoming an outsider. Would that be a correct assessment?
No, it's not, but they have another foreign policy positions on quite a number of different issues. But as I said, NATO is not an organization where we harmonize our foreign policy. We harmonize our defense policies, and we unite on the necessity of territorial defense and the principles of the rule of law. But then, of course, foreign policies could be different. I mean, we have more of a effort to harmonize foreign policies inside the European Union. Not a smashing success in the last few weeks, I have to say, but the ambition is there. NATO is a different bird.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bildt. This has been Carl Bildt, former Prime Minister and ex-Minister of Foreign Affairs of Sweden. Hope to see you on TV Rain again soon.
We operated in Russia for 12 years, and the government tried to get rid of us 3 times. They got us on the 6th day of the war in Ukraine.
Мы временно приостанавливаем работу телеканала.
We left Russia, but we kept going. We have now decided to tell the truth about Russia, the war, and Russian society in English as well.
Kherson is Putin's 3rd major defeat in a row.
What is wrong with the Russian army?
Stories no one else can tell you. Hear it right from the source. Subscribe to our channel.